Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Brothers in Arms Hell's Highway for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is attempting to be a first-person tactical shooter developed by Gearbox Software and published by Ubisoft in September of 2008 for consoles and then the following month for PC. And it went on to receive some fairly middling reviews. Most people seemed to like it, but it wasn't anywhere near as well received as the first two games. And a lot of fans of the series seem to think that this game sucks compared to the previous two games, which I have to laugh at considering that the first two games in this series were downright awful. Which of course brings up a couple of questions. The first of which is, why are you playing this, TW? You obviously didn't like the first two games, there's no way you're going to like the third one. Actually, there is a way I might like the third one. If they improved it, because they did actually change up the gameplay between the first two games and this one, so I decided to give it a chance. Second, are fans of the series just talking out of their asses and saying that this game sucks because it's just not exactly the same as the first two? Well, hopefully that's the case, but let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out exactly how this is compared to the other two games in the series, as well as compared to other tactical shooters. Well, as far as presentation goes, this does have superior graphics to the previous two games, but one would hope that considering that it came out 3 years after the other two did. It runs on Unreal Engine 3 as opposed to the Unreal Engine 2 of the previous two games, and it looks okay. I mean, the environments themselves look rather good, all things considered. They're pretty well detailed, they're surprisingly colorful given that this was released around the time when everything was trying to be brown and gray and realistic. But in this particular case, they decided to go with something a bit more colorful, and it does work out fairly well in the long run. Unfortunately, that is the only thing I can actually praise about the visuals, because the modeling is just average at best. The animations in particular are downright awful in a lot of respects. The first-person animations just look terrible, and the character animations themselves are passable at their very best. And then of course there's the lip syncing, which is all over the place. In the cutscenes themselves, it works alright. There are a few hiccups here and there, but when you're running around on the ground and you're yelling out commands to your various squad mates, you actually don't see their mouths moving at all when they say anything, and it's actually kind of jarring.
Move to that position! I need you over there! That way! Double time! Go! Move it!
And when you move over into sound design, things really don't get much better. On the one hand, the voice acting is still fairly good, but frankly that's a staple of the series, so it's really not surprising at all, and it really doesn't help the game out that much in the long run. Music's pretty generic World War II orchestral fare, and it does sort of work in context, but it's so tiring to hear that, especially so long after World War II shooters were relevant. I mean, World War II shooters were overdone by the time the original Call of Duty came out in 2003, let alone in 2008. To say the soundtracks were pretty much indistinguishable from one another at that point is definitely an understatement. Then of course there's the sound effects, which are average at best, but mostly pretty wimpy. None of the gunfire sounds particularly powerful. In fact, almost all of it sounds like it was ripped straight from a stock sound pack. And I really can't say I'm surprised by that, considering that the previous two games had the exact same problem. So overall, the quality of the presentation ends up being pretty lackluster, but it gets worse when you factor in the fact that there's so many cutscenes in this game, and they all have terrible camera work. They try to do that sort of shaky cam in the moment deal, and it ends up looking terrible, and on top of that, now it's extremely dated. But even worse than that is when you get a particularly nice headshot or a grenade kill or something explodes, then chances are it's going to zoom in on the action and go into slow-mo so you can see the grisly details and see how much of a badass you are. And that presents a pretty nasty problem for what really matter here, which are the story and the gameplay. You see, the story in this is that you are once again Matt Baker from the previous games in the series, and you are leading your squad along in Operation Market Garden as you fight to open up what is known eventually as Hell's Highway. And all the while, the game is trying and failing miserably to tug at your heartstrings and try to get you some sort of emotional connection to these characters who all like to complain quite a bit. They make really terrible jokes that aren't remotely funny, and despite what the Steam page will tell you, they really don't grow or change much at all throughout the course of the game, and you're just going to be dealing with a bunch of rather bland, uninteresting characters throughout. This is made worse by the constant beating you over the head with the "war is hell" message. And the funny part about that is, they're trying to make it seem like, oh, this is all the horrors of war, and war is hell, so you should treat it seriously, and all that sort of thing. And yeah, they have slow-mo headshot and explosion cams, and you got ragdolls flying everywhere because that's how they handle death in this thing, so everything just looks pretty ridiculous when you get down to it. I hate to use this term because it's a pretty dumb term, but ludonarrative dissonance does apply here, because the gameplay is not at all in keeping with what they're trying to do with the writing, which is in itself ludicrously cliched and extremely non-nuanced. I mean, the Germans in this thing are portrayed as pure evil and nothing more. They're not even just Waffen-SS or anything. They're just the normal Wehrmacht, and I mean, the very, very first thing you see in this thing, other than the very intro cutscene that says, "Previously on Brothers in Arms," which is stupid, by the way, you get to see a panning shot of a church, you hear some gunfire and a scream, and you find that the Germans mowed down a girl in the street, because, you gotta say that the Germans are evil, right? Because apparently we've got to establish that during World War II, Germans bad, Americans good. It's cheap, it is lazy, and it's indicative of the writing in not just this game in general, but in everything Gearbox has ever done apart from Half-Life Opposing Force and Blue Shift. And honestly, at this point, I'm almost convinced that either everyone who worked on those games left the company before they started making everything else, or the writing in those games was so behind the scenes and not really needed to enjoy the game that there wasn't any possible way they could have screwed those up. Because ever since then, their writing team has been woefully inadequate, and Hell's Highway is no exception. If anything, the bad writing was more excusable in the previous Brothers in Arms games because they didn't have anywhere near as many cutscenes that are unskippable. So in this one, the story is constantly being shoved in your face like they seem to think it's the best thing ever, when in reality, it's just pathetic. We get it, you've seen Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan. So what? Maybe instead of regurgitating those and trying to slap a "war is hell" message on top of that in the most obvious manner possible, you should have done something a bit more original. And speaking of original, they probably should have done some more original things with the gameplay as well, because what we have here is an extremely rudimentary tactical first-person shooter where the only 3 commands you can give are go to this location, rally on my position, and attack this target. You can't really set up ambushes except for a couple of instances in the game where it allows you to get your guys into position before the enemy shows up, nor can you really do anything other than the same exact thing you did in Brothers in Arms 1 and 2, which was suppress this target and use this second team or yourself to flank. Occasionally you'll have to direct your bazooka team to blow the living hell out of a target like a MG nest or a tank or something along those lines, but that's as varied as the tactics get. No real planning, just instant reacting on the spot with this very rudimentary tactical system. And it gets incredibly boring incredibly quickly. Not just because it's the same damn thing that you were doing in Brothers in Arms 1 and 2, which got incredibly boring incredibly quickly, but because in this one it is almost pointless. If you really want to, you can pretty much play this like any other World War II shooter and just go in guns blazing. I mean, you'll probably die a lot, but that's what cover is for. Yes, there's a cover mechanic. So you can take cover behind something and lean out to shoot at things, which makes things actually wildly easier than the previous 2 games because now you've got a cover system to deal with, and you've got superior accuracy when you're in cover. Means that you can pick targets off from a long range, unlike in Brothers in Arms 1 and 2, where you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. In this one, at least if you sit there and wait for your sights to stabilize, or if you sit there and wait for your crosshair to shrink, you can get some degree of accuracy out of the shots. But if you're using machine guns, then just good luck hitting anything, because the shots go wildly all over the place no matter what you do. And once again, the weapons are just incredibly unsatisfying to use as a result, only instead of being like in the original Brothers in Arms or its sequel, you don't have to worry as much about the sights going wildly all over the place, except when you're moving and when you first sight in. Because when you first sight in, the sights wobble all over the place and then they stabilize, which is of course broken if you decide to move around a bit, because then they start wobbling all over the place again and take a bit more to stabilize. The problem with that is that there's really no point in using the iron sights at all, because you can just go into cover and use the crosshair, which is considerably easier. But DW, you're saying, it's a tactical shooter, you're not supposed to just go in and shoot everything yourself. You're right, you're supposed to use your squad, who are still a bunch of idiots. Although, they seem to have taken some remedial classes because they're at least not anywhere near as stupid as they were in the previous two games. Now they don't quite blunder out into the middle of enemy fire as much as they used to. Instead, their derpiness tends to come from the fact that they're really not all that useful. I mean, just look at this. I had to pick this one guy off because the team was standing right there in front of him and for some reason couldn't hit him. You know what, I can't even really be mad at these squads for being as mostly worthless as they are, because at least they aren't running directly into enemy fire like they did in Road to Hill 30 or Earned in Blood. Instead, they're just kind of sitting around like a bunch of idiots, and the enemy AI is really no different there. Half the time, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. But that in itself completely undermines the idea of this being a tactical first-person shooter. If it's a tactical shooter, you need to be able to command your squads around and have them actually be important to your gameplay. If there's not much reason to have them in the game, then why include them at all? And they prove this by throwing in numerous segments in the game where you're by yourself and you do everything just fine. I repeat, what is the point of making it a tactical shooter if there is no reason to engage in the tactics part of it? At least in Road to Hill 30 and Earned in Blood, you needed your squads because you were basically useless by yourself. In this, you might as well be playing a generic World War II shooter because you're pretty much an unstoppable juggernaut of death. And that gets incredibly boring incredibly quickly, which in turn actually makes this worse than the previous two games. Because you know what, at least the previous two games were so irritating they made me angry. In this, while the writing was irritating, the gameplay itself was just mind-numbingly boring. And while I can channel frustration or anger into something useful, I can't do a damn thing with boredom. Ultimately, I'm legitimately impressed by what Gearbox did here, because they managed to take a series that sucked, Brothers in Arms, of course, Road to Hill 30 and Earned in Blood just both being awful games in and of themselves, and managed to make them worse by improving on the mechanics. That may sound like a complete oxymoron. How can you possibly make something worse by improving its mechanics? Well, in this case, you do it by taking something that's bad and also making it boring at the same time. And thus you end up with something that's both bad and boring, which ultimately makes it terrible and something I cannot remotely recommend. Ultimately, it is an extremely good thing that this series finally died at this particular game, because if it kept going, I can only see it getting worse from there on out. To summarize, I give Brothers in Arms Hell's Highway a 1 out of 5. If you absolutely, positively have to pick up a World War II tactical shooter, don't make it any of the Brothers in Arms games. Make it something like Hidden and Dangerous 2 instead. Thanks for watching.